here.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Sven, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here in person and online. Can I just get confirmation that everybody can hear me and see the PowerPoint?
Sorry. Yes, we can hear
Great.
you perfectly, and we see your PowerPoint, so everything is fine.
Great. Great. Thank you so much. I was thrilled to learn of this call. Thank you to Hanna and to Sven for this invitation to what Hanna called conservation conversations. I was thrilled to learn of this call to explore the overlap of art and cultural conservation and nature conservation. It's something a topic I came to myself quite late in my research project on the history of ecological restoration, which I'll describe some today, and concepts of design and the relationship between art and science have been essential to how I've come to understand ecological restoration and its distinction from preservation, which I'll spend a few minutes today talking about as well. In writing about the politics and history of restoration, who gets to decide where restoration projects happen and what should be restoration's goals, I came to this kind of intersection. And so in this lecture today, I'm going to very quickly overview the history of the ecological restoration movement and how practitioners distinguished themselves from wilderness preservationists, and offer the big argument that ecological restoration is a design practice, and as a design practice, it's an inherently political one. So to begin with some quick context, the question of how to restore biodiversity is one of the most pressing of our century. Species are struggling, confronted with climate change, ocean acidification, persistent pollution, and habitat fragmentation. There's currently more than 44,000 species that are threatened with extinction, according to the IUCN, and the UN Environment Program puts that number even higher, around 1 million species. And extinction is not the only thing that is going on. It's also that the number of individuals within any given species is also decreasing dramatically for a number of species. So the number of individual trees worldwide has declined by approximately half since the rise of agriculture, some 12,000 years ago. And there was a 2018 paper that estimated that people have decreased the total mass of wild animals on Earth by about 85% across history. So by all of these different metrics, biodiversity is suffering. At the same time, the amount of human artifacts in the world is increasing, and this is a rather chaotic graphic from a paper in Nature that was published in 2020. But the thing to take away from this graphic is that at the left side of the axis in 1900, the man-made objects of the world weighed approximately 3% of the total weight of all living things on Earth. And this is represented as biomass, which is actually the dry weight of all plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, archaea, and protists on the planet. These scientists believe that as of 2020, we were at the tipping point, or the crossover point, rather, where the weight of anthropogenic objects and artifacts on Earth is about equal to the weight and mass of all living things on Earth. So whether or not we call this the Anthropocene, we're living in a time of rapidly changing relationships with other species. Of course, societies have formally managed their relationships with other species for millennia. Preservation and restoration in this way are really nothing new, as the archaeologists in the room will argue to us. But today's two most dominant land management practices, preservation and restoration as we know them and as we practice them, have their roots in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And these are the movements that I'm going to briefly overview today, as I think they're, I share Hanna and Sven's call that there's really incredibly productive work to be done thinking about the relationship between these movements and movements in art and cultural heritage preservation, restoration, conservation, and thinking about what these words mean. Preservation is limiting the use of a property through laws or sometimes through literal fencing. It is hands-off. It is passive. It is a regime that's grounded in property rights and that imposes a Western idea of property rights into other places. And it supposes that the ideal state of nature is peopleless, that other species will best thrive without people. Restoration is active. It's an attempt to undo a past or multiple past environmental harms. And its relationship to property rights is more complex, I'd argue, than that of preservation. It supposes the ideal state of nature involves human work. It supposes that other species will not be able to thrive into the future without that human work. And yet it has to date embraced a unpeopled aesthetic and what I argue is a wild aesthetic. And this is what in my book, Wild by Design, I explore this kind of desire to hide the labor of restoration, a desire which I imagine has clear parallels in art restoration, where the work itself is meant to be invisible or near invisible. The first national park in this preservationist mode was established in 1872, Yellowstone National Park in what is now the United States. Today, this is an ecotourism spot, but one of the original goals of Yellowstone, were not biodiversity protection. They were to make profit for railroad companies and to forcibly seize land from Native American nations. The United States Army took charge of Yellowstone and evicted Crow, Shoshone, and Bannock communities. And this is one of the first instances of what journalist Mark Dowie has called conservation refugeeism. Yellowstone was followed by the Royal National Park in Australia in 1879, Banff National Park in Canada in 1885. You can see a kind of clear settler colonial thread here. Switzerland has the second oldest national park in Europe, the Swiss National Park, which was established in 1914. So as environmental historians, we often say the preservation movement began in the 19th century, but its ascent globally is actually much more recent. This is data that I compiled on the total global extent of formally protected areas worldwide. And you can see that although national parks and formally protected areas began to crop up in the 1870s, it really wasn't until the 1980s that this idea of hands-off preservation or fortress preservation, particularly in the name of biodiversity protection, really took off. And this is a map of another way of looking at this. This is a map of the global extent of what are now 280,000 protected areas worldwide, covering around 17% of land and 8% of marine area. Despite this massive increase in preservation, biodiversity continues to decline precipitously through, as measured by some of the metrics that I shared on the first slide. And it seems clear that in an age of habitat destruction and climate change, many wild species, that this is not sufficient, that many wild species are not going to survive on the unprotected 81%, 82% of land without ongoing acts of human care. In Wild by Design, I argue that restoration offers a more hopeful and a more pragmatic path toward biodiversity protection than preservation. As the title indicates, the book explores the tensions between wildness and design, our respect for other species' autonomy, and our desire to control other species, including the aesthetics of other species. So in it, I analyze the history of ecological restoration as an idea, a practice, and a scientific discipline. Restoration emerged a little bit later than preservation, and actually as I can go into more detail in Q&A, kind of in response to, as a critique of preservation in the early 20th century. Over the 20th century and over this timeline, we can see three big shifts in the practice of restoration. The first is a shift from restoring single species to an emphasis on groups of species, or what we now call ecosystems. The second is the consolidation of restoration from a diffuse kind of volunteer-based network to an endeavor that's increasingly consolidated, professionalized, privatized, and corporatized, with the kind of the emergence in the 1980s of the Society for Ecological Restoration, and it's now being possible to get degrees in ecological restoration. There being scientific journals for ecological restoration, et cetera. And then the third kind of change over the 20th century, particularly relevant to this workshop, is that restoration, ecology, and landscape architecture shared many common origins, and in some ways were the same field in the early 20th century. They were tightly coupled, and they have diverged across the 20th century as the relationship between art and science and design and science has continued to, the distance has continued to widen. So we can think with early ecological restoration and early ecological restorationists' work about the role of non-human species in design and in art. The Society for Ecological Restoration currently defines restoration as the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. Looking over the longer history of restoration, in Wild by Design, I define restoration somewhat differently. And again, happy to go into this in more detail in Q&A, but I define it as an attempt to co-design nature with non-human collaborators. And one of the things that I find so interesting about restoration is that it involves so many different techniques and activities. It involves nurturing desired species as well as killing undesired ones. In the upper left photo, a sniper is shooting non-native goats on Isla Isabela in the Galapagos. In the top right photo, a volunteer is enacting a controlled burn in a longleaf pine savanna in the southern United States. And then in the bottom left, there are, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but volunteers with the International Crane Foundation dressed up as parent whooping cranes in order to teach a baby whooping crane how to follow the flock. What unites these diverse projects is that they're motivated by a desire to undo human-caused ecological damage, and also that they are each in their way kind of attempting to strike a balance between human action and non-human autonomy. Restoration can work and vary dramatically. Just to give a kind of visual that might stick with you. This is a farm on the coast of Brazil in 1990 that was replanted that year with native vegetation, and just 20 years later, that property looked like this. So restoration projects like these are increasingly at the center of international environmental negotiation. 2 years ago now, the UN Biodiversity Conference approved the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which kind of enshrines restoration as one of its goals. And in response, this past year, the European Union passed the restoration law, which requires member states to introduce measures that will restore nature on 20% of their land and seas by 2030, and to put measures into effect by 2050 for all ecosystems that need restoration. This legislation also calls for billions of trees to be planted. So in addition to these kind of responses to the UN Biodiversity Conference, NGOs, governments, and private foundations like the Bezos Earth Fund are investing billions of dollars in reforestation, in particular, in carbon offsetting, which I have my elsewhere kind of critiques of, and other modes of ecological restoration. And at this moment, it becomes imperative to understand the history and politics of restoration, and in particular, who gets to decide where ecological restoration happens and how. So I thought I would very briefly pull out 3 examples from Wild by Design that I think can be brought into productive conversation with art and cultural heritage conservation. The first being bison restoration, the second being the kind of rise of ecological gardening and an attention to communities of plant species, and the third being the International Crane Foundation's work on whooping crane restoration. So to begin with bison, in the decade after the American Civil War, settlers killed some 5 million bison. Some hunted for sport and some for profit, but one of the main reasons that bison were killed was to force Native Americans into a reservation system and to erode tribal sovereignty. By the late 1880s, there were less than 1,000 bison left in North America. And in 1905, a small group of wealthy Anglo-Saxon men in New York City decided to found the American Bison Society with the goal of restoring bison to North America. The American Bison Society lamented the decline of the buffalo, but not for moral or scientific or aesthetic reasons, but for economic and explicitly racist ones. So in magazines, the American Bison Society argued that the federal government should restore wild bison because they might prove profitable in the future for white hunters and ranchers. In 1906, the American Bison Society purchased a small herd and placed it in the New York Zoological Park, and soon thereafter proposed the establishment of a restoration reservation on the Kiowa Comanche reservation in what is now southwestern Oklahoma. Like bison eradication, bison restoration depended on the ideology and administrative apparatus of settler colonialism. So as of the 1880s, the US government, federal government had established some 300 Indian reservations across the country. But during the early 1900s, the federal government took a different approach to Native American policy and began to pursue a policy of assimilation rather than segregation, dismantling the very reservation system that had so brutally established a few centuries prior. So under the Dawes Act of 1887, the federal government was authorized to dismantle and sell Native American reservation lands. And over the next 50 years, the land area owned by Native Americans was reduced from 138 million acres to less than 48 million acres. the federal government sold reservation lands to white settlers and to railroad companies and other large corporations. But something that historians have kind of overlooked is that portions of Indian reservations were also became the nation's first wildlife reservations. The Kiowa Comanche reservation was opened to non-Indian settlement in 1901, and in 1907, the American Bison Society persuaded the federal government that this should be the first site of bison restoration. In doing this work, the government constructed corrals and telephone poles and steel fences. They killed hundreds of coyotes and wolves. The goal was not to recreate a particular historical baseline or moment, but rather specifically just to bring bison back to this area. And here's a photograph of the first bison returning to what had been Kiowa and Comanche land and what became the Wichita Game Reservation. So because of the work of the American Bison Society, there are roughly 400,000 bison in North America today, up from around 1,000. Bison restoration is celebrated as one of the most dramatic examples of restoration success globally. And in celebrating the work of prior generations to protect and restore native plants and animals, less often do we talk about the land on which this restoration happened and how that land became available, who had the authority to set it aside, and who was consequently expelled from it. And in the case of the American Bison Society, the bison was the object of restoration. The goal was not to restore relationships between bison and other species or to restore relationships between bison and native nations, but rather to use bison to further seize land from native nations for white colonists. So quickly, the second example I'd like to mention is that of the Vassar Ecological Laboratory, which was established in the 1920s on the East Coast of the United States. And I argue in Wild by Design that this was one of the first examples of ecological restoration. So notably, this project had both scientific and artistic goals. It was founded by Edith Roberts, who was a plant ecologist and one of the first women, as it happens, to receive a doctorate in botany in the United States. When Roberts arrived at Vassar College to teach in the early 1920s, she immediately began setting out to establish what she called an ecological laboratory. Her goals were twofold. First, to establish a facility to train students in scientific botany. But second, she wanted to test whether native plants could be reestablished on degraded soils. And so beginning in 1921, Roberts and her students cleared over 4 acres of grasses and poison ivy from the Vassar College campus. And on this land, they planted around 600 species collected from across the northeastern United States, arranging them into different plant communities. This work led Roberts to collaborate with Elsa Riemann, a landscape architect who began teaching part-time at Vassar in 1923. And a few years later, they co-authored a book, American Plants for American Gardens, that is one of the first, was one of the first kind of popular books on using native plant species for gardening and for what we now call restoration. They argue in the book that the job of an ecologist is to establish the environmental conditions in which native plants can thrive. So it's really an emphasis on the restoration of conditions rather than the restoration of particular species. And they argued, notably too, that a wild aesthetic was achievable through constrained and artful human intervention. And this is why this book in particular was so useful for Wild by Design and for thinking through these issues. So they write that the ideal restorationist would make sure to plant species that were appropriate to the climatic conditions of a site, but that they would also consider the decorative qualities of species, that they would make sure to plant heights of different plants of different heights and different colors that would be blooming at different times of the year. And so that they would have both, that restorationists would have both a painterly, really, an artistic training, as well as a scientific training, understanding the climatic and requirements for a particular species. And they spoke of landscape in terms of compositions that changed over time. The ability of a restorationist to create either a true reproduction or a sympathetic interpretation of an ecological community. And I think that this language of true reproduction versus sympathetic interpretation is kind of the precursor for today's debates over whether restoration projects should strive for historical fidelity for true reproductions, or whether they should attempt to anticipate what ecological communities will look like in the future, what we might call a sympathetic interpretation. And the final example I'd like to offer from Wild by Design is from the 1980s. We'll return briefly to single species restoration, this time the endangered whooping crane. This is a photograph of biologist George Archibald, who spent 3 years straight living with one endangered whooping crane, whose name was Tex. You can see Tex in this photograph as well. So Archibald's relationship with Tex began in 1975 when federal biologists sent Tex to him because they could not figure out how to get this incredibly endangered species to breed in captivity. And so I think the question of where breeding in captivity fits into restoring nominally wild species is a very interesting one, because breeding in captivity is such a domestic practice. When Tex arrived to Archibald's center in Wisconsin, she was one of only 35 whooping cranes left in the world. And the trouble was no one knew how to get whooping cranes to breed and how to get them to breed in captivity. So Archibald spent several years acting as a male whooping crane with Tex, calling and dancing in the hopes that it would shift her into reproductive condition so that artificial insemination might succeed. And again, after 3 years of living with this one whooping crane, Tex laid a fertilized egg. It was the only one that she laid before she died. And Archibald said in an interview later, "I felt like a father. I was so excited." Cranes take turns incubating eggs. And so Archibald would take a turn every few hours sitting on the nest, shifting his sleeping bag over to keep the egg warm when Tex was foraging. And this one chick that hatched went on to sire 178 whooping cranes. So this kind of one act of care is really the reason that their whooping cranes aren't doing wonderfully, but there are now thousands of whooping cranes. Moving forward, as more whooping cranes were bred, there weren't enough adult cranes to take care of these baby cranes. And so volunteers would dress as, and still do, dress as adult whooping cranes in order to teach them how to forage and teach them how to follow the flock. Whooping cranes are highly social birds that learn from their elders. And to teach young whooping cranes how to fly, volunteer restorationists dress up as adult whooping cranes and teach them to follow. And I find this example so compelling because it highlights how intimate, really, and how specialized restoration work is. But whooping crane restoration was not without its controversy. In 2001, the International Whooping Crane team attempted to establish a new migratory population by using ultralight aircraft. You can see the person driving the aircraft is dressed up as an adult whooping crane. In order to try and teach the juvenile whooping cranes a new migration route. And many restorationists and environmentalists saw this as an overstep, which is very interesting. This seemed too artificial of an intervention, unlike this situation. So this people generally were very positive about the kind of adult humans raising the whooping cranes, but then once the technology of air flight was kind of involved, people felt that it was destroying the wildness of the whooping cranes. And after running this program for more than a decade, the US federal government decided that using aircraft for whooping crane restoration was too artificial, and they disbanded the program. So this discomfort with using such a visible technology for restoration, I think, is kind of the important thing to think about here, because wildness, it would seem, denotes autonomy, but in an age of habitat destruction, anthropogenic climate change, and the redistribution of species through globalized trade, wildness requires curation. I end the book thinking about how climate change is increasingly pushing restorationists toward more interventionist management, such as assisted evolution, and assisted migration. So assisted evolution being kind of looking for or even genetically modifying organisms in order that are able to better withstand changed, in this case, more acidic water, in the case of looking for bleaching resistant coral, and then assisted migration being moving species to places where they historically were not found, anticipating that they will thrive in that place with climate change. Faced with the prospect of between 3.8 and 5.2 degrees, sorry, that's Fahrenheit, but equivalent Celsius of average temperature increase by 2100, what does it mean to care for a wild species? What does it mean to design a wild ecosystem? Leading up to this workshop, I've been thinking about how the history of ecological restoration could inform art and cultural heritage conservation, but I think there's also many ways in which art and cultural heritage conservation can and should inform ecological restoration. So I'll say very briefly that I've touched upon the idea that for decades, many ecological restorationists have attempted to kind of hide the visual evidence of their work so that a restored ecosystem or site appears natural or appears wild, even though, as we saw with the whooping crane and the bison restoration examples, this involved very intensive, very hands-on work. So I'm curious how art conservators are thinking about marking and documenting their interventions, both either for really even ethical reasons, for reasons of the historical record, and making sure that future conservators know what their particular work was, and to think about what ecological managers and environmental managers might learn from these practices. I also find myself thinking about the uniqueness as a topic. So as I detail in Wild by Design, restoration has really embraced off-site mitigation in the past 2 decades. So this is a photograph of the first off-site mitigation project in the world, the Disney Wilderness Preserve, where this restored site was built in the 1990s to compensate for the destruction of a wetland at what is now a Disney park, 50 kilometers to the north. So the practice of off-site mitigation is doing restoration work in one area in order to compensate for environmental harm at a separate site. And this was not a inevitable practice, and it's not an obvious one. It severs the site of environmental damage from environmental repair, and it treats ecosystems as interchangeable. This is off-site mitigation is the concept upon which carbon offsetting operates, right? The idea that the global north can pollute and then compensate for it by doing reforestation or restoration work in the global south, many more kilometers away than 50 kilometers away. So here I can't think of a parallel with art and cultural heritage conservation, which seems to center the unique identity of particular objects with particular histories. Whereas this mode of ecological restoration really treats ecosystems as interchangeable and as fungible, and not as unique or precious. So looking over the history of ecological restoration in the past century, what unifies the practice, I argue, is that restorationists have attempted to collaborate with other species, and collaborate is the verb that I kind of landed on in this project. A restoration project is the result of both human agency and non-human agency. Whether a seedling that is planted in a forest survives or not will depend on the act of care of planting itself, as well as squirrels perhaps redistributing seeds, deer eating, whether or not a deer eats that seedling, hotter and wetter temperatures, promoting growth, but also promoting disease. I argue that in thinking of restoration as collaboration with other species, we cannot forget that restoration is an inherently political act, not merely a scientific or technical one, and that restoration is also collaboration with other people, as well as with other species. Early restorationists sought to respect other species, but they often failed to respect the decision-making of other people, grounding their work in white supremacy and colonialism. Ecological restorationists and art conservators might together ask, who gets to decide where and how conservation occurs? And how do we think about whether loss and decay is inside or ultimately outside of human control? So I will end there. Thank you.
Good. So thanks very much for, I think, a really, fantastic, wonderful sort of bird's eye view on the history of ecological restoration, and also for helping us through these examples, thinking through some of the, the politics of conservation that we want to raise within, this workshop. I'm sure there are numerous questions. We have about 10-15 minutes for discussion, Q&A. Perhaps I can just, while people are perhaps still thinking on, on questions they want to raise, perhaps just ask a first question to you, which was basically inspired by the fact that on the one hand, you've actually shown, or you've basically said that ecological restoration is a sort of more hopeful, more pragmatic, but also more hopeful alternative. Yet you show this graph of preservation, which actually seems to be going global in a sense only very recently in the 1980s, which then might be a reason for pessimism, I assume. Or about the politics behind and the governance behind this sort of globalization of preservation. I mean, the way you present it, it seems to be a sort of national park movement really originating in the United States, then coming and then going global. And so, what would be the role of governance agencies, etc., in actually making this a sort of global movement also?
Sure. So I argue in Wild by Design and kind of elsewhere that restoration is kind of fundamentally more hopeful and optimistic practice, because so much of preservation so much of the preservationist movement kind of presumes that that environmental degradation, however a particular environmentalist thinks of it, will continue into the future, that there's no changing of politics, and that all that can be done is to protect particular small areas from the transformations that are occurring globally. It's really this kind of refuge model of habitat, that biodiversity will be kind of confined to these areas, and that everywhere else is a sacrifice area. And it's, I think the reason that it has taken off, I do think it is a kind of largely, though not entirely, kind of American model of property rights and of the relationship between nature and culture that is being exported elsewhere. Again, particularly to former and current kind of colonial sites. I think the reason it is spreading is that it is easier in a way. It is the practice of purchasing or seizing land and then putting it aside. And so in that way, it is both passive and it is kind of grounded in ownership as the solution. Whereas if improving the conditions for biodiversity in unprotected or unpreserved areas is much more complicated, because it requires, I think maybe where both preservation and restoration could fall down or could be seen as pessimistic is that it's possible to do both without addressing the underlying causes of ecological damage. And indeed, critics of restoration would argue that the doing of restoration is actually just facilitating corporations or polluters from further damaging the environment, because they can then claim that we'll fix it later, basically, that it's a Band-Aid. And so, and indeed, much of the history of restoration that I lay out in Wild by Design is quite pessimistic. And so it's a little bit of maybe a trick to argue that this is a hopeful practice and science. But I do think that restoration, that the idea at the heart of restoration is that human action can not only be damaging, but it can also be healing. And that there's this core kind of argument by many restorationists that indeed societies have an obligation, an ethical or aesthetic obligation to do this work. And I think that there is something optimistic in the idea that there is something to be done.
Okay, thank you very much. There's several questions in the room. We have to sort of pass on the microphone from one to the other. So I'll walk over here and then...
Thank you very much for this very inspiring talk. It triggered a lot of questions and a lot of comments in me, also case studies from Switzerland. I don't know where to start. So maybe I start with you saying we co-design nature with non-human species. Where do you then draw a line between culture and nature?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just reminded of Ian McHarg's book, Design with Nature, from the 1960s. That was maybe a step before. Yeah, and another question is, in Switzerland, we have kind of blurring boundaries between the protection or restorations of nature and culture with this association called Heimatschutz. And they did not divide into natural heritage and cultural heritage. They protected trees and monuments and landscapes and gardens all together. They had this kind of hybrid wish to aesthetically prevent the landscape from being built and being misused. Do you have this kind of example in the US as well, or is it more nature culture divide that is obvious?
So to work backwards, because the first question is a very difficult one. I would love to speak more afterwards too, to hear more of your thoughts about where this line between nature and culture or human agency and natural agency lies. But there are some examples, but few in the United States and Canada of cultural heritage projects that are connected to natural heritage projects. I live in Vermont, which is a former agricultural area, which is now mostly forested. And there are programs, there are farmland restoration programs, basically at the state level, not at the federal level, but incentives for landowners to put their land into agricultural production. And that argument is uniquely, it's not about kind of the food system, making the food system more resilient, or the argument really is an aesthetic one, and it's for tourism. And the idea is that the only way to keep these viewscapes and landscapes rural and agricultural is to create these kind of economic incentives for people to continue to farm in this region. So that's the one. And the other example I would say is, so very briefly, the second site that was created by the American Bison Society was created in Montana, and was land seized from the Flathead tribe there. And that bison herd has been under the Biden administration was returned to the tribe. And they have started a program that is both about cultural restoration, the restoration of land management practices within the Flathead Reservation, as well as bison restoration. So there are some indigenous initiatives as well that are tying the cultural, the restoration of cultural practices with the restoration and cultural landscapes with the restoration of nature landscapes. But there's many more examples of that sort of work happening, I would say, in Europe than there is in North America.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks very much. There's another question over here.
Thank you very much. I do follow your argument about that you need a distinction between conservation and restoration. I've worked on early earth art and land art movement, and connected that to the public art funding scheme by the National Endowment of the Arts, as well as to the 1970s Environmental Act that kind of followed the restoration paradigm, that is to restore nature to something like to a prehistoric, untouched nature, this kind of idea that they had. And so this is more as thought of as a restoration practice. And I'm wondering how this both etymologically and the history of restoration versus conservation figures in your own thinking. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So and I know that we have to switch to the next presentation, so I'll be brief, and again, happy to follow up over email more about this. But when I started, I thought about another talk I might have given today would be specifically on ecological timelines and baselines, because when I began this project, I presumed based on how, so within North American restoration in particular, until quite recently, there was a real emphasis on restoring to a pre-colonial baseline, to a pre-1492 baseline in this case. And when I started the project and started looking at the archives of restoration work, I presumed that restoration practice would have always been about time, would have been about restoring, I mean, the word itself, right? It suggests a return to a previous state. And so I presumed that the kind of work that's being done today to kind of reinstate particular assemblages of species that were, pre-colonial, for example, or ancient, that would have been what restoration has always been. And then my project was kind of thrown off, and I was surprised by and intrigued by the fact that it really wasn't until the 1970s that restorationists really emphasized a return to in this case, pre-colonial baseline, and that there was a much wider range of goals of restoration prior to in the earlier part of the 20th century. And I came to this work too kind of in the school of novel ecosystems, and having originally been trained in ecology, kind of under the paradigm that climate change is going to make it impossible to return a particular site to a historical baseline anyway. So what are we doing as restoration scientists and ecologists? And so in thinking about kind of redefining restoration, I was seeking a way to think about kind of what projects that are not concerned with historical baseline and projects that are kind of share in common, and how do you talk about restoration and still use the word without depending on a return to a prior state. And I think, and I argue kind of in much more detail in the book, that one reason that restorationists in the 1970s and 1980s clung to the idea of using a historical reference state to design their restoration projects was that it felt like a way of honoring the autonomy of non-human species. And that got me thinking about autonomy. But autonomy led me ultimately, autonomy could also, going back to the prior question, autonomy could be the total separation of society from a way to honor a species. Autonomy might be to totally sever society from nature, right? And so to think about the ways in which I do think restorationists are trying to respect the autonomy of other species and allow them to continue to exist, but in this way that actually is very intensive, very involved, very intimate, and that is really a collaborative project and process between people and other species.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, our time is up for now. So thank you very much, Laura, for kicking off our workshop in such a fantastic way. I very much hope that you have also the opportunity to stay a bit online and join in. So please do so. So for now, join me in thanking Laura for her lecture and talk.
Thank you, everyone.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is rather daunting to follow Laura Martin, in part because her book, Wild by Design, was a deep inspiration for the research that I'll be talking about. And in fact, hearing her today made me realize how much we were informed by her book. I recommend it to anybody, Wild by Design. I'd like to thank the organizers of this workshop for inviting us to speak today and report on our workshop. Of course, Sven is one of the organizers, so he's also a co-author of the research that I'll be presenting. And I'd just like to mention the image that you're seeing here will come up later in the presentation. It's an example of indigenous controlled burning, so we will get there. I'd like to begin by describing our research project, where it all began. As Sven mentioned, there was a workshop in Leiden in 2022 at the Lawrence Nias Center called Conserving Art and Nature. And I'll just read a statement from the document from that workshop to give you a sense of what it was all about. Starting from the broad realization that the aims of fixating in time or restoring into a former pure state are essentially flawed. We need to reconsider concepts, motives, practices. This workshop brings together researchers from both domains for cross-disciplinary dialogue on the challenges of decision-making and sustainable management of change. So it's a very high-level, inspirational setting for art conservators and nature conservators to come together for a number of days. And I think very much that this workshop here in Bern, starting right now, follows that workshop, which is why I wanted to come all the way from Los Angeles to be here, because I was so stimulated by the last one. I wanted to be at the second one. I feel like a little bit like a refugee. As you may know, Los Angeles is burning. I will tell you a little bit about that and what's going on with our program right now. Very much climate change induced, so we'll get to that as well. And I won't even mention refugee from the political situation in the United States, but can easily talk off the mic about that. At the conclusion of this workshop in Leiden, we all decided that we would write two different articles, that groups of authors or researchers would write two articles. One would be by nature conservators on what they can learn from cultural heritage conservation. The other would be cultural heritage conservators on what we can learn from nature conservation. So that's the genesis of the research that I'll be reporting today with my colleagues, Sven and Marcia. This is an image from an excursion that we took during that workshop where we actually visited a historic home and garden. And just the visit led to a lot of discussions about how historic homes and gardens are where it all comes together. People are concerned with the landscape, the garden, the building, the history, the environment. And so a lot of the theory and practices merged together. So it was a really wonderful, stimulating place to visit. The presentation will be divided into two parts. The first, I should be watching the time here, I guess. Okay. The first part will be introducing cultural heritage conservation. That's not what our research is about, but we thought there may be some nature conservators here that might not know much about cultural heritage conservation. So please forgive me if you're in that field. We will go through some of the basics of theory and practice. And then the second part will be reporting on our research, what we've learned, what we think we can learn from cultural heritage conservation. The field of cultural heritage conservation covers fine arts, cultural heritage materials, the built environment, historic structures, archaeological sites, and more recently, we're including intangible cultural heritage, and I'll get to that as well. Beginning in the Enlightenment, certainly through the 18th and 19th centuries, it was increasingly framed as a science. So moving from traditional restoration, as you might see here on the left, towards a self-identification as scientists. This is what our labs look like on the right. This is the training lab at the University of Amsterdam, where conservators are wearing white smocks, using a lot of analytical instrumentation in the service of researching and treating cultural heritage objects. We have a material focus, material performing the analysis of cultural heritage objects, the fabrication and the deterioration. So here on the left, you see photographs that's experiencing yellowing, fading, foxing, insect damage, and that's our focus. How is it made, and how is it deteriorated? And then, of course, the fire of Notre Dame. We're looking at the built history, the materials, how was it deteriorated from the fire, the strength, the engineering, the architectural, and the rebuilding of it. So again, we use a lot of analytical instrumentation to better understand works of art and heritage objects. As you see here in the research lab at the University of Delaware, another graduate program in conservation. And on the right, this depiction of agents of deterioration. So this is a way for us to organize our thinking about how cultural heritage objects deteriorate in the service of preventing this deterioration. So we look at physical forces, criminals, fire, water, pests, pollutants, light and ultraviolet light damage, incorrect temperatures, and incorrect relative humidity. And then finally, disassociation, which means taking the object out of its historical context or losing the documentation associated with the object. And I love this image. Marcia put this together. I can't take credit for this. She's brilliant at collages. We've got a couple of them in this talk. So this demonstrates the hands-on work of conservators, just to make the point that we are a profession that actually physically intervenes in the life of objects. We clean, we reconstruct, we restore, which we'll get to in a minute. And we were struck in Leiden by a number of the nature conservators who were really impressed at how organized we are in our approach to cultural heritage objects. We have codes of ethics that are developed by local, national, international organizations and ratified by their membership and constantly revised that guide us in our practices. We develop research and decision-making models. I'm not going to go through this one. This is just an example of developing all the steps that various people, conservation professionals, would take in this case, in preventive conservation. And on the left is another example of modeling our research and practice. This one comes from the conservation of contemporary art, developed by Dutch colleagues in the late 20th century and revised by a group of international colleagues in Cologne just a few years ago, that guide us in the process of research. So we might first research the documentation associated with the conservation object. We then perform condition assessments of the objects. We look at the changes over time in materiality and in meaning. And then we discuss those changes and assess the discrepancy from what it was to what it is now. And then we make decisions about what we should do. Should we intervene? Should we not intervene? And we're very consumed by documentation at every step of the way. On the right is an image from my work at MoMA when I interviewed Jennifer Alora and Guillermo Casadilla about a work that MoMA had acquired. And in this case, it's a grand piano with some of the strings cut out, and the piano player stands in the middle of the piano and plays Beethoven upside down and backwards while rolling the piano around the gallery. Well, as you can imagine, over time, different people are going to play the piano might deteriorate. And so the kinds of questions that I had to build documentation for future staff at the museum were, what should they wear? Should they be trained classical pianists. Where should they roll the piano around? So just really basic questions that would build institutional understanding about how this piece can be re-exhibited in the future. So in contemporary art, where we can't really look at the past, we have to construct an imagining of the future, and the best source, of course, is the artists if they're around to ask. So far I've been talking about materiality, science, documentation, and our processes in conservation, but we're also guided by principles, theory, and ethics. And there's been a long history of thoughtful writing in our field and debates in our field. I point you to one very important author, Alois Riegel, who in 1903 wrote a seminal article called The Modern Cult of Monuments, Its Essence and Its Development. And just very briefly, what he did was lay out a system of values associated with monuments, or we could say cultural heritage objects more generally. For instance, he discussed age value, historic value, intentional commemorative value, art value, use value, newness value, relative art value, and so on. But the idea here was for researchers to identify which values were associated with the conservation object and decide which values to honor in the hands-on intervention. So he was one of the first authors to say that actually there are non-tangible values. And of course, the field has changed a lot since then. We now identify multiple and contested values that change over time and place. But I look to him as sort of the father of this thinking over 100 years ago. Or just for instance, age value and historical value. So with age value, we might honor an object in a state of decay or ruin and value it as such. With historical value, we might honor the period in which it was created. So we might want to restore it back to some understanding of what it looked like. So these values and decisions about the values guide us in our conservation work. And just to extend this, in the 19th century, there was a grand debate over restoration versus preservation, and we'll get to these terms in a minute, where John Ruskin said that restoration is a lie from beginning to end. It means the total destruction which a building can suffer. So he was an anti-restorationist, whereas Viollet-le-Duc embodied a very different attitude about restoration. He was a very serious art historian, researcher who studied medieval architecture, styles of medieval architecture, and performed pretty radical restoration. In fact, the facade of Notre Dame that we know today is very much a product of his vision of what Gothic architecture should look like. So many people don't know this, but when you look at Notre Dame, it's a lot about Viollet-le-Duc's idea of Gothic architecture. And so that restoration versus preservation debate lives on today in many forms. And that's why I'm pointing it out now, because I think it's a real fundamental debate that we still have over many of the conservation projects that we do. For instance, when Notre Dame burned recently, there was a big debate on whether to return it to Viollet-le-Duc's image of what Gothic architecture should look like, or something else. Should it be a more creative restoration? Should we evolve and do something completely different that speaks of our time today? In the end, they decided to restore it back to what Viollet-le-Duc had restored it to. And on the right is an image taken by Marcia just a couple of weeks ago when she was in Paris, just to bring out another dimension of conservation and agents of deterioration. And in this case, it's tourists. People in a building can actually contribute to the destruction of the building through changing the temperature, the relative humidity, the graffiti, and so on. And another dimension of conservation, I think, manifests in this quote from Emmanuel Macron. He said, "The blaze at Notre Dame was a national wound. It is now repaired, reinvented, and rebuilt." This word national comes up a lot. And so cultural heritage conservation often is in the service of developing individual, local, and national identity. In fact, it can be used to construct national identity very deliberately by regimes in power. That's a whole other lecture, but I thought I would just mention it. Moving on, climate change, very much discussed, and I think it's the increasingly the most challenging element in our midst that is not only causing destruction of cultural heritage, but this kind of deep anxiety about what the future of the earth holds. This is very much where cultural heritage and nature conservation come together. But just in terms of cultural heritage conservation, we talk about rising seas, we talk about fire, hurricanes, other climate change induced catastrophes. Within conservation, we also talk about greening our conservation labs, using recyclable materials, and so on. The image on the right is the Getty Villa, where our research and training labs are for my program. This was a couple weeks ago. It still stands. However, everything around it burnt. So we don't have access to it right now. We've had to, in fact, a lot of my time right now is spent moving our courses to campus and other places because we can't teach there. I don't think we'll be able to teach there for years, frankly, because of the rebuilding that's going to go on Pacific Coast Highway and Sunset Boulevard, the main arteries to get to the Getty Villa. Our students already take buses for over 2 hours to get there. Well, it's going to be a massive construction site. This is just in my mind. So I'm working very hard to start getting maybe emergency funds and other funds to construct research and training labs on the UCLA campus because of this fire damage. Moving on. So as I mentioned before, we now think about intangible cultural heritage. So not just as Riegel would have told us about embedded values in objects, we're now talking about intangible cultural heritage itself, which is dance, performance, ritual, spiritual activities. And so now cultural heritage conservators are conserving them as well. Which goes way beyond my interview with an artist about how to play a piano in the future. It can be about any form of immaterial cultural heritage, which is just really moves us forward in thinking about tangibility and intangibility. Ecologies of care. I'm not going to go through this really wonderful diagram by our colleague Debbie Hess-Norris, other than to say that there are many people involved in conservation. This is specifically about contemporary art, where we've got scholar curators, artists, consumers, and conservators, scientists, and so on, with all of the dynamics that go on in researching and deciding about how to conserve cultural heritage. Community collaboration and indigenous knowledge. And now we're getting closer to what's going on in nature conservation. Our field has realized, and it is increasingly realizing, that just as as Laura was talking about, wilderness preservation that removes humans from wilderness. Objects in museums have been removed from the people who created them and used them, either through illicit or the marketplace. But our field is shifting towards honoring not only these people and what they have to say about the care of the objects and the meaning of these objects, but often turning over responsibility to indigenous representatives, which may mean repatriation and even reburial. So there's a lot of rethinking about practices in our field that I think parallels nature conservation. So with that, we'll start the second part of the presentation. Inspiration from restoration ecology. And here I'd like to just say once again, reading Laura Martin's book, Wild for Design, was very inspirational because she framed not only the history, but the theory and the practices of ecological restoration. And well, let me just say that we were really struggling at first. We've been working on this for 3 years. We read her book, but then we read many more books and articles. We've had many Zoom calls to discuss what we're reading, and now we're evolving to the point where we are highlighting some theory that we're gleaning from nature conservation. We landed on restoration ecology as a field to investigate because we felt it was most parallel to cultural heritage conservation. And one of the questions that we had was, what's the difference between restoration ecology and ecological restoration? And I'm glad Laura's here because maybe she can help us with that. But our understanding is that restoration ecology is the sort of field in which theory is generated, so research and theory and understanding, whereas ecological restoration is actually the practice. So we might compare that to cultural heritage theory, people like Riegel and Ruskin, Viollet-le-Duc, and others, to the actual practice, the hands-on practice of cleaning and repair. Another one of March's wonderful collages. In this case, it's just illustrating the similarities of the work, where, first of all, that both fields are hands-on in practice. We might be cleaning and repairing a cultural heritage artifact or replanting out in the woods. But also both fields do perform scientific analysis to help us in guiding our practice. Okay, we're going to get text heavy now in some of the slides, and this is partly because we don't have images from a field we're studying as opposed to a field that we're doing, but also because we want to really sort of highlight the lessons that we're pulling out of the field of restoration ecology. And I'd also just like to say we're not giving you a whole picture of restoration ecology as Laura was doing. We're deliberately pulling certain things out that we think that we can learn from as cultural heritage conservators. The first ones I'll just go over very quickly: climate change, scientific authority, and human exclusion. The next three I'll talk about with slide illustrations. So climate change, as I've already said, is an existential threat that we're all facing today in all fields, everywhere. And it's very much influencing new ways of thinking in both of our fields. As I said, in cultural heritage conservation, we're trying to green our labs, use more recyclable materials, lower the carbon footprint, for instance, in museums, to allow for greater fluctuation of temperature and relative humidity, which have created very large institutional footprints for museums. Scientific authority, both fields, I think, have been dominated by science. And as I mentioned, it sort of manifested in focusing on materiality in cultural heritage conservation. And as Laura mentioned, it manifested on trying to understand the dynamics going on in nature. Human exclusion, a parallel is just as in the preservation movement that Laura was talking about, setting aside reserves, national parks, and driving out the human inhabitants with this notion that humans should not be involved in the sort of renovation, reconstruction of a natural ecosystem. Similarly, as I mentioned, we've taken artifacts from humans, put them in museum basements. So there's been this disconnection. And both fields are moving in the direction of re-including humans in the systems of care and growth. I will now move to terminology. So I'm so glad that you asked the question about definition of restoration and conservation, because we've been grappling with this as well. And in fact, if you hadn't asked it, I was going to, if there was time. So maybe, Laura, we can get back to this, or anyone in the audience, because this became quite fundamental. At first, we saw the words conservation, preservation, restoration. We thought, great, both fields are using the same words. We've got a lot of similarities. But then we dug a little deeper and realized that we're using these terms very differently, and maybe there's something we can learn from these differences. So just very briefly, in restoration ecology, preservation is protecting environments by excluding human intervention, as Laura described it. Conservation is the active management to minimize environmental damage, so that's human activity. And restoration is the intervention in the lives of plants and animals while maintaining a certain wildness. Now, it's much more complicated than that. Read Laura's book. But that's just a real sort of reduction of some of the basic ideas embedded in these terms. In cultural heritage conservation, preservation often means protection through minimizing deterioration and preventing loss of informational content. Conservation is the treatment and preventive care to preserve for the future. And restoration is a return to a known or assumed prior state, often through addition of non-original materials. So these are very different uses of these terms. And the one that became most interesting for us is restoration. And I'd just like to point out that for us, it's returning something to a conceived past or original state. The difference that we're seeing, and maybe Sven can add more in discussion, because he's been, I think, the one that's really driving us in this direction, is that in restoration ecology, there's much more of an emphasis on ecosystem, or the components of the plants, the animals, the inanimate objects, including air, water, land, that's all part of a system. And we don't think like that in cultural heritage conservation. We're thinking of like the object. Should we clean it, repair it, restore it? We're not thinking necessarily of the people associated with the objects, the use of the object, the environment that it's in, the context. And so I think, but we're moving in that direction. So I would say we're moving towards a definition that's much more similar to the way it's used in restoration ecology. Let's talk about that later. I'm going to move on. Systems thinking. This is probably the most impactful area of restoration ecology that we've identified. Ecosystems, for instance, is defined by the Society for Ecological Restoration as the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. And much of the ecological restoration practices evolve around the central concept of ecosystems. Ecosystems are a means to understand the world around us as consisting of and interactions among living organisms such as plants, animals, microorganisms, and abiotic or non-living components such as soil, water, and air. So ecosystems occur in different spatial scales, from small ponds to whole landscapes. And the concept of an ecosystem relies on systems thinking or assemblage thinking. It evokes interdependence among different elements within the system. Novel ecosystems, which Laura did reference, are systems, ecosystems in which humans were very involved in creating. So they're like a farmland, I suppose, where they are new, they didn't exist before, and they're very future looking. So that's been very helpful about thinking about human intervention in cultural heritage. Restoration ecologists talk about reference systems or reference models. And again, this is new, I think, for us in cultural heritage conservation. And I'm so glad that Laura just talked about this. So we can look at historical reference models to try to understand what was there, say in pre-colonial context, what animals were there, what plants were there, what inanimate objects were there. Reference models are increasingly considered as dynamic, so they're not static, they change as plants and animals adapt, for instance, or as humans intervene. And future reference models. So we might want to design something that doesn't even exist today. So anticipate an ecosystem by putting whooping cranes back in the environment or reintroducing buffalo. And I might just add that, we were kind of scratching our heads like, what can we learn from like imitating whooping cranes? Where does that come to cultural heritage conservation, or buying land from Native Americans or stealing land from Native Americans and introducing buffalo? And we realized that a lot of the practices don't necessarily carry over, but some of the thinking does, which is why we landed on restoration ecology as opposed to ecological restoration in our analysis. And another term that's used is shifting baseline syndrome. And Marcia has been reading more about this than I have, but I will just can get my cursor down here. Oh, well, I can't seem to move my cursor down, so I will just try to remember what it is. It's systems baseline syndrome is this notion that generations of people, including conservators, forget what they used to know or what one generation knew and the next generation doesn't know. So the points of reference are always going to be different among individual people as they get older, but also among generations. So maybe back in earlier times, we would have thought of just using craft technology to restore an object. And then under the scientific paradigm, we might say, well, no, let's analyze the corrosion, analyze the original fabrication materials and use those materials, or use different materials that look the same. And now younger generations are certainly talking about other priorities, such as climate change, such as introducing indigenous thinking into the work that we do. So that's a notion of shifting baseline syndrome, which I think, again, could be very beneficial to our field. ecosystem changes. So we do use the term degradation and damage. We don't use the term disturbance, which is very big in restoration ecology literature. And this is just um, a diagram that illustrates how over time ecosystems can be disturbed and how they can come back into a steady state or reach new states. I'm not going to go through all the details of this diagram, but it's a way of thinking about a system and disturbance in the system. Whereas degradation and damage, refers to breaking a pot or corroding metal or varnish yellowing. It doesn't refer to the larger system or the context with which the cultural heritage object is in. So we like that idea of disturbance, maybe over degradation and damage. Both fields are moving towards community-based practices, from human exclusion to community empowerment, participatory research models that we borrow from the social sciences, a very action-oriented, indigenous traditional knowledge in cultural heritage conservation. We're learning about traditional knowledge and care and use of cultural materials. We're engaging cultural heritage representatives and elders. And as I said, negotiating, well, what should we be doing with these objects, including sometimes repatriation, or introducing traditional care practices even within museums. In nature conservation or ecological restoration, again, traditional ecological, TEK, knowledge is being introduced into restoration activities. And as I mentioned, reference models are being used, but now indigenous reference models. And I have a case study that I want to mention right now that we'll be featuring in our writing. This is the Elephant Hill Fire in British Columbia that took place in 2017. On the image on the top is the whole hill burning. And the image on the bottom is an example of indigenous controlled burning. And researchers at the Department of Forest and Conservation Services at the University of British Columbia are working with Indigenous scholars and community leaders to develop an action-oriented framework for Indigenous-centered restoration and management of fire-adapted ecosystems. And by using these traditional practices of controlled burnings as reference systems, they seek to restore an ancestral practice that not only reduces the risk of these megafires, as you see on the top, but stimulate the growth of endemic medicinal plants and food sources. And these are some examples of food sources, morel mushrooms and nodding onions that are now growing in these burnt areas. So under the care of controlled burning and indigenous practices, these food sources are now coming back. We love this idea of walking on two legs that came out of the same literature, primarily one article. And I'm going to read this quote quickly because it's just so inspirational for us. As a strategy of reclaiming indigenous knowledge and stewardship practices, walking on two legs addresses how indigenous practitioners and thinkers connected to our specific ancestral territories resume care of our homelands and by reclaiming and reinvigorating our indigenous knowledge as we engage with Western scientific knowledges. As we do this, we must protect the moral and ethical integrity of our own indigenous knowledge and be mindful that it never stands in the shadow of Western knowledges. As we walk on two legs, we face the dual task of reconstructing and practicing our indigenous knowledge while undoing the harm done by ongoing colonial practice and exploitation. As we do this, ethical and reciprocal Western science that advances indigenous stewardship and restoration can be our ally. So for preliminary conclusions, I think systems thinking and embracing change are two large concepts that we can learn from restoration ecology. And in reflecting on what we've learned so far, so some of these larger concepts, if the practices don't carry over, some of the larger concepts, I think, do. And I just love this quote, so we decided to use it. It's from Leonard Cohen. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So that kind of reflects a shift in our attempt at conserving cultural heritage to allow change, honor deterioration, and honor indigenous practices, as in the Japanese practice of kintsugi, as you see on the right. And as Rodney Harrison and others have argued, it may be best to think about these two fields not as separate, but as a continuum. So we look forward to hearing your thoughts, discussion today and over the next couple of days. I want to thank you for listening, but first I want to acknowledge the participants of the Lorenz workshop that we referred to for all of the fruitful exchange that we had then, which sowed the seeds for the research that we presented today. And we acknowledge in particular Mikael Purmer and Mans Scheppers for their valuable discussions and literature suggestions for our research, and of course the financial support for the Lorenz Nias Center workshop. And I'll leave you with some references. We can leave them up for a few minutes. This is just a very short list of all that we've been reading, and we'll be able to disseminate that soon. The article is taking shape and it will be published fairly soon. We're almost there. So with that, thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much, Glenn. That has been really inspiring, very insightful. We could also, if you agree, add these readings to our reading list for this workshop. If anyone wants to consult, as you know, we have distributed reading lists for this workshop, but now we have just a few minutes because we did run slightly over time. Just a few minutes for questions to Glenn, to Sven, and to Marcia. Please, to say yes. You have to use the mic.
And the working definition of the three terms. Just based on your own presentation, I'm wondering if you should add caretaking to it as a fourth term that is opening up more or other practices as well to restoration, conservation, and preservation. And in that regard, I was also wondering, one of the slides in the first part, that was a diagram that you showed on contemporary art, which is my field. You named, or the title that you gave to it was Ecologies of Care. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on what your what your conception of this ecologies, because I'm thinking about exhibition ecologies and thinking about what ecologies could mean in this regard, but how you would frame this ecologies in regard to the diagram. Thank you so much.
Well, first of all, should I be the one to answer this? Because Sven and Marcia are both here, but well, I guess to be expedient with time, I'll just begin. Thank you for that. I think caretaking is absolutely critical, and I think that's a great idea. We should address it because it invokes not only the caretaking that we do, but the traditional caretaking of communities, indigenous and other communities that have been around forever, that we disregarded as a field and are just now coming back to and realizing, oh, these traditional methods of care, almost by their nature, have much lower carbon footprint than the kinds of caretaking we do with chemicals. So thank you for that. Great idea. And yeah, ecologies of care, I think we use that to invoke systems thinking, ecological thinking, and this notion that it's not just the conservator and the scientist or maybe the art historian or possibly the archaeologist, but it's also the artist in contemporary art and all of the people they work with, as well as the collectors. But in another realm, it also might be the indigenous caretakers, elders, community members. And, you know, there are other arenas of community-based practice where people interact with objects in their environment and have a lot to say and have deep concern about. I'm thinking of Civil War monuments, for instance, in the South in the United States, where people have very strong feelings about how these objects should be cared for or not cared. So it is an ecology, and it's, in our way of thinking, a very helpful way of thinking. So.
Marcia, would you like to chime in very briefly, because you are asking, can we turn her voice on? Thank you.
I wasn't sure if I could speak. Yeah, first of all,
You
hello.
can, yeah.
Yeah, okay, wonderful. Thank you, Glenn, for presenting on our behalf. What I put in the chat was that I was thinking of care, and I actually think it's not like a fourth bullet point, but it's the motive or what stands at the basis of all the approaches that we have listed. So people try to care through preservation, conservation, or restoration strategies. So I think it's even more central than that. That's what I wanted to add to this. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And also, I just would like to put on the, on the table the kind of thinking that Glenn already mentioned, in contemporary art conservation. Recent thinking about performance conservation, also networks of care. Hanna is here as well, who authored quite an amazing amount of work on this notion. Also, thinking about systems in networks of care of contemporary art performers. We had just this festival here to acknowledge this as well a few weeks ago, which officially ended actually our performance conservation materiality knowledge project, but in which really, people the communities that produced work and cared for this work came to speak. And it was for me really very revealing that conservation or caring is happening in those systems and ecologies also outside our expert domain. And perhaps it would be something we could then speak also later in the discussions. But I'm afraid that we need to move on, but there will be much more time in our discussion groups later on. I hope you are okay with this. It's just a short Q&A. Glenn is here and everyone is here for later discussions. Please join me in thanking Glenn, Sven and Marcia again for this wonderful presentation. And we look forward to more discussions. All is fine, Ravi.
Okay. Thank you very much, Hanna, and the research team for inviting me to speak as I'm an artist and environmentalist for the last 25, 30 years. That's what I've been pursuing. And in this particular talk, and I was listening to the last talk as well, and some of the issues which were raised resonated with me greatly. But I'll use my practice as an artist and the language of art to explore my journey through this question. And this is how I've structured my talk in terms of what you will hear from me today, the question of science and nature, then talking about some projects which I've done a lot of projects with communities, think about fractures in the idea of nature, the question of justice, purity, and pollution, and about my work on multi-species entanglements and the new glossary around it, and some conclusions. So I'll just start by putting the question of nature in as a question, because the word nature is not easily translatable to all cultures and all languages. They have very different meanings, but it is a word which we use today. There's also a word which brings about the universal idea of what nature is, as from the aspect of science. It's a kind of universalization of the natural system. But this is not, as I said, always true. And I think questioning what nature means in a social and political perspective really helps us to examine, how to think about this question. I'm going to read a small quote from the famous author Amitabh Ghosh's work. It's a small essay he's written called Wild Fictions. And he's describing a legend, a myth in the Sundarbans, which is the biggest, one of the largest deltas of the Brahmaputra and the Ganges in South Asia, located in South Asia. He writes, the Born Bibi legend, which is a legend of the local goddess, uses the power of fiction to create and define a relationship between human beings and the natural world. Nowhere does the word equivalent to nature figure in the legend of Born Bibi. Yet nowhere is consciousness absent. Though ecological concerns are never named, the story is profoundly informed by awareness, which is the literary critic Larry Boyle has termed the environmental unconscious. A phrase that is all the more useful in my view because it does not invoke the cultural linguistic freightage of the word nature. And trying to move my slide forward, sorry. Yeah, so these are going on the path. These are 4 books which really impacted me through my journey of learning. There are 4 books. There are many others as well, but these things mark out very specifically. They started being published in South Asia in the mid-90s, and they're from very well-known scholars. The first is a book called Fencing the Forest, written by historian of environmental historian Professor Mahesh Rangarajan. This book, Fencing the Forest, is one of the first books which talks about the creation of the edifice of imperial forestry in the late 19th century, and which had major consequences for the people, trees, and wildlife of India, India's central provinces. It really shaped the idea of what a forest is, and it also shaped the idea of what forest control meant. The second book, which is really one of the path-breaking books written by 2 scholars, Madhav Gadgil and Ramchandra Guha, called Ecology and Equity, which was published in 1996, speaks about how inequities to access to natural resources contribute to social conflict. Basically, what it's saying is that the idea of nature is produced in a social access to natural resources. The third book, which is again a path-breaking book by Professor Beena Agarwal, who's a feminist economist, called Fields of One's Own, talks about the basic argument is that the single most important economic factor affecting women's situation is the gender gap in command over property. And since property means land, it's an empirical research, and it really changed many of the laws in India regarding property rights. And the fourth book, which is more recent, by a scholar called Professor Mukul Sharma, who teaches in Ashoka University, brings out hitherto another trajectory of fracture in the idea of nature, and basically talks about caste. Caste, as some of you might know, is understood as a constructed and distinct historical and social entity, whereas nature is considered as natural, common, and inherent. However, the two are deeply intertwined. And this book talks about caste-based structures which have shaped environmental discourse and practices in India, and that the Dalit or the caste experience is a distinct experience of the environment. What these 4 arguments about gender, equity, colonization, and caste tell us that nature is produced differently by different historical and political trajectories. We cannot, of course, forget the colonization of nature. And of course, many scholars have written about this. Amitav Ghosh writes about it more popularly, about the bringing in of scientific forestry and the export of labor for commodity agriculture across the world. And scientific forestry, and you see Dr. Data Brandis was the first Inspector General of Forests in India, imported from Imperial Britain through Scotland, and was a German by training. It really involves managing forests through systematic practices like controlled harvesting and replanting, and it can significantly impact local ecology by altering the composition of plant species, disrupting wildlife, affecting soil quality, and impacting water flows. So the argument to be made here is that nature has been shaped and reshaped through all these constructs. And so one can say that, again, quoting from another well-known book called Nature in Translation, that there is not one nature, but many natures. And nature, again, through this sort of contests the universalization of the scientific idea of a planetary system, which exists on its own, of course, but it's not the only way which brings into social and human life. So the representation of and the production of nature, if I may use the word production, really changes how we think of it. And when we try and restore it, what are we really restoring? And what are the roots of restoration? Is it just restoration of destruction of a certain kind of degeneration of nature? Or do we have to restore the very social system through which that nature is produced? And I now would like to talk about these four of the many ways in which legal reconfigurations of nature have happened over the years in different parts of the world. And they all have followed a certain kind of colonial history, in a sense, a certain kind of eviction of the local. The Wilderness Act of 1964, which is a public law act in the US, has roots in environmental racist histories, where the idea of pure nature was to take out all indigenous people from forests. And the similar kind of idea was followed in the Indian Forest Act, which was rewritten in 1927, which is in British colonial times, which also talked about the idea of pure nature as if people did not exist. Of course, the people who were then evacuated were the indigenous people, and it was then thought of as something from another kind of power structure. Similarly, if you look at Scotland, history of Highland clearances, the postcard variety of Scotland which we see today has been a result of the early 20th century clearances and the decimation of the big carnivores like the wolf. I'm going to intercede some of what I'm saying through some of my own work, in a sense, which has been deeply sort of related to what I'm doing here. These are three copper prints which talk about three major leaders who have contested in the last post-independence India, last 50 years, and led three major movements to contest the commercialization and the control of nature. You see Medha Patkar there. You see who led one of the largest anti-bad dam movements in the world. You see on the bottom right, the person who led the movement against the takeover of Sacred Hill, a large sacred hill for aluminum mining, which was then overturned by the Indian Supreme Court. And on the bottom left, you see the picture of Gauri Devi, who was one of the leading persons who the famous Chipko movement, where women, as you see in the upper right, hugged trees so that the contractors could not cut them. So this idea that nature was something which local people wanted to protest against and to keep intact from these powers of a kind of scientific progress and scientific development has been contested continuously. This is a work I did recently about looking at what I just call the Dalit experience and the Black movement. And there is a lot of connection between, for example, the environmental justice Black movement in the US and the Dalit movement. One is based on race and the other is based on caste. But you find this in these histories of oppression in a Frantz Fanon kind of way, that though these histories are very different, there's a common history of oppression in how people who were disenfranchised or part of a lower social order uh, did not have the same access to resources as somebody else might have. So the perspective through which the word nature is then brought in becomes extremely important. On the extreme left is an image. Of a hand which is painted in black, but on a leather, because many of the Dalit production of work has been working on leather. In the middle is the idea of these are fragments of the large images of black slavery and cotton slavery, and the third is mixture of text from two books. One is Juthan, a Dalit's life from a famous, well-known Dalit author, and the other text is from an anthology of Black poems called Black Nature, published in 2022, I think, in the US. This is, again, an image of a project which was done by a Dalit artist, Rajshri Gudi, who comes from a family of poets. And a lot of her work is to do with her relationship with food. And she writes that experiences of hunger, begging, shame, guilt, and eating leftovers weave into one's of feasting, joy, delicacies, and happiness, revealing the complex and deep-rooted links between food and caste. So food is, of course, one of the primary reasons why nature is exploited. And she's a ceramist, and these are all works from clay and from porcelain. I now would like to turn to, this is another image from the idea of, on the left, you see the father of the Indian Constitution, Dr. Ambedkar, who was also coming from a Dalit family. And on the right, you see a picture of a waste picker, who are mostly from lower caste or Dalit families. And here, what I wanted to say was that the notion of purity and pollution, which becomes naturalized, because as I said, nature is a word which is naturalized, and then the caste word also naturalizes the human body in terms of purity and pollution. It's a very important concept, much like race in India, because this is something which is you inherit by birth. And for example, many lower caste people are not allowed to touch water, which are owned by upper caste people. Although it's illegal, but it's still true. And so hence the idea of water to a person from a lower caste, lower in the social hierarchy, is very different than the idea of water which an upper caste person will have. These are some images from my work with waste pickers, because waste pickers are also people who come from a lower caste, from scavengers who are classically lower caste, or from migrant labor. Most of them come from lower caste. This is from a book I did on labor in the early 2000s called Down and Out. And also the kind of indignity and the inhuman conditions in which they are forced to work. This continues till today, and when we talk of the big economic growth, we also have to remember on what labor does this economic growth stand on. These are the two books which I just mentioned in the earlier talk. Now I'll turn my attention to a project which I did. I don't really call them projects. My interaction with over a few years with the fishing community in Tamil Nadu, which is off the Bay of Bengal in the south of India. And the question which I constantly thought about was, is the sea I see the sea they see? Well, that's wrongly written. It should be the sea they see. And the question was that, do we see the same nature? And it led to the creation of, this is my friend whom I constantly have worked with. It led to this kind of installation, local installation, which I did there, which was an outcome, one of the last images I did, the outcome of asking my friends, the fishers there, what the sea meant to them. And these are the words which they used to tell me what the sea meant to them. It was very different from my idea of the sea, because the sea to me was an abstract concept. It was either beautiful or stormy or calming. But for them, it was very material. It was about the daily, everyday aspects of life. And this was a very stark difference of what lived nature meant, which was which was part of the everyday culture and also the part of what they saw. So though nobody asked them what climate change was, they very well knew how the sea was changing. And you can talk to any of them, they'll tell you how the sea has been changing over the years and including from day to day. So they didn't need any kind of expertise to see that the environment around them is changing. It's quite obvious to them. They have suffered damage because of it. But also that they live it on a day-to-day basis. Here, sorry, got messed up a bit. Sorry, excuse me. So here, oh God. I'd like to talk a little bit about the deep cultural relationship they have with nature, which is deeply integrated with their cultural underpinning. So the division of nature and culture is really not present there. And of course, when we talk in a landscape like South Asia of the indigenous, we're not talking of it in the sense like you talk of in South America or something which is non-European, because here these are living traditions. And the indigenous and the modern is actually completely enmeshed in people's lives. There are many moments of many transitions, but this is not a clear break, like you see in lots of parts of Europe. It's not a clear break. And while I was working with the fishers, I was led to this strand of poetry called Sangam poetry. And Sangam poetry dates back to 300 BC in the language they speak called Tamil, but it's a classical form of Tamil which no longer exists. And on the right, you see the poet who led me to these books on poetry. They were rediscovered in the 20th century, and these are two major translations of it. But basically, they talk about the relationship of the landscape with people's lives. And though they were almost 2,000 years old, this poetry, it could be contemporary poetry, because it is completely a-religious. It doesn't talk about religion. It talks about human love and different kinds of love in different kinds of landscapes. But the landscapes are not metaphorically bought into human lives. They are coexisting. It's like the two parallel worlds which exist. And this kind of coexistence, which is very marked in Sangam poetry, something which very drew me, and I did a substantial amount of work based on this kind of relationship, because I'm deeply interested in this idea of how we relate to the world of outside the human, the more the human or the non-human. So, of course, we can speak a lot about this poetry, but given the time we have, just want to mention it to you. These are images because I spent a lot of time with this community and actually still do. These are from the fishing festivals they have. And of course, they have these two major festivals, the Nagai and the Adi Peruku festivals, which are a living tradition there, in which they celebration of of the fish idols. It's a celebration of fishing. It's a celebration of the gods who they consider give them a good catch. And it is really when they are guided by these ideas. Uh, they have a local temple which they preserve, they keep, and of course, it's not like the traditional conservation of what a local temple would have been. They have refurbished it. To my eyes, I would have preferred the old one, but they have refurbished it to their needs in a sense. And these are annual festivals which take place in February every year. And so these are living traditions of nature culture integrations. Uh, this is another body of work which I did with marigold growers on the river, banks of the river in Delhi. And it is about how these local villagers think of sustainability and conservation of local landscape. So they are growing marigold flowers on the banks of the river without any fertilizer because the soil is quite fertile already. But they also have they also uh, uh, this is also community labor. It's based in villages which are there for 200-300 years, and then they sell them in local markets. Of course, there's a big move to, they want to create this land into sustainable land. And the question is that things which are already sustainable, what new ideas of sustainability can you bring to this complete cycle of organic flower growing here? It's a small text. I'll just read because I think it's my reflections on this place. The river, it's not just a water body flowing through the city, but a network of myriad relationships, interconnected to the city and its people and to nature. Each connection and exchange and interchange, where the wise, fathomless waters give as much as can be received. The city slumbers along, unaware of the river, of its giving, and oblivious of the deep connections which exist. River flows on, passing through rural land into a densely urbanized Delhi. Vegetables, flowers, water, sand, and livelihoods give way to concrete, dirt, filth, crisscrossed roads, and displaced, unconnected lives. Peace, quietude, tranquility exchanged for fragments. So, because the river is constantly in contest in India, because of the many changes, urban changes, it's constantly dirty. But here you find the relationship to the river is very different than you find in the city. This is a cycle of flower growing you see, and of course, if you go to my website, there's a whole text on it. There's a small book on it, which you can download if you like. And there's some of the installations I've done looking at the complex entanglements of livelihoods and nature and culture which exist. I'd like to now switch to a little bit to this idea of multi-species worlds. This is a project which I did very early on in 2009 as a public art project in a museum. It's called Extinct. It talks about the story of the vulture, the South Asian vulture. The South Asian vulture, some of you might know, is almost 99.5% extinct in the last 25 years. And I'll read out a small text from my book on this. The story of the near extinction of the vulture is also the story of the fiscal and political power of economic and industrial processes. It's indeed a reduced life we inhabit, and the loss of the vulture is evidence of that. For one species which came upon this planet probably even 100 million years ago, there is no journey left, almost. The vulture is increasing no more, wiped out from the staggering tens of millions in a number in the subcontinent, even a couple of decades ago, to less than thousands, tens of thousands. Over 95% of them have died in a large mass extinction, which has been ever known in the recorded history of mankind, all killed amazingly by one innocuous spill. And the pill is a pill called diclofenac, which is a painkiller. And if you use it on livestock, the residue of that goes into the liver of the kidney of the vulture and kills the vulture. There's a very interesting scholar in, these are images from a public installation. There's a very interesting scholar who has written a book called Flightways. The scholar's name is Professor Tom von Duren. He talks about extinction. I think very interesting what he says. He says the widespread loss of vultures due to diclofenac poisoning has in turn has had stark implications for the flourishing of the human communities whose everyday life was entangled with vulture flightways, although other communities such as wild dogs, rats, and potentially even anthrax microbes have been able to thrive in this new environment. And he talks about, the book talks about the need to develop a richer account of extinction, which takes into account the longer histories and future potentials of species, as well as their co-constitutive entanglements with the environment. So I often think that, there is now a vulture regeneration program, which is breeding less than a few hundred vultures every year. But the breeding biology of the vulture is that they probably have one young every year. So when you have such a mass extinction because of one chemical, it's almost impossible to bring it back. These images you see on the screen are images I shot in the early 70s and 80s when I was a bird watcher. And these are from Delhi, from the forest in Delhi. And of course, you don't see any such vultures anymore. They're completely gone. So when we think of conservation and restoration, we also have to think of the systems which are deeper than what appears on the surface, which have caused these kinds of extinctions or destructions. This is another work which is I've been doing on the Indian river dolphin. This is particular installation from the Lahore Biennial, which I recently participated in. I'll just read a small text about this. This is a work with a sound piece. Today, the Indus dolphin, Bhulan, Platanista gangetica minor, is largely found in the Indus in Pakistan, while its gangetic counterpart, Susu Shushak, Platanista gangetica, exists in some stretches of the Ganges and Brahmaputra and tributaries. These genetically diverse but visually similar toothed whales evolved into two separate species only about 550,000 years ago, as has been very recently confirmed in 2021. Both these are critically endangered according to the CITES list. So what has caused these long histories of mammals, animals, birds to come to raptors, to come to this quick extinctions is more to do with many other factors outside how these ecosystems have been destroyed or how they have been inflicted upon than what is happening now. I'd like to also, because one of the things I say always that we have to think, as was said in the last presentation, we have to think of how the idea of science as a knowledge system and other knowledge systems have to work together. They have to see them as allies, not as one against the other or one without the other, because we are today in a world which is different and we know much more about it than we ever did. This is a project I did with a glaciologist, Dr. Polina Lopez. It was shown recently in a biennial in Switzerland. It's working with glaciers. She's a glaciologist. And it was shown in this old church. And these 4 videos are reflections on 4 questions and interviews with anthropologists who come from indigenous backgrounds about what the idea of the glacier is and how the indigenous ideas have been of glaciers have been wrongly, incorrectly depicted in contemporary textbooks and contemporary literature, and that the indigenous has been completely been sidelined or not been acknowledged for what it offers. And how to get that back is not a small problem, it's a major problem because it's a major challenge. But part of this collaboration is also to think of how to get over this challenge, because what I learned from working with Paulina is that science itself is messy and does not itself make the claims which we make of science. So science is a messy endeavor, as is any other knowledge system. And in those messiness probably could lie the possibility of some allies and interactions. Lastly, I like to show you a project called multispeciesart.org. It's a project I did during COVID because I was bound in my studio and library. And it's really an online project, and I'm going to take you to the side. I hope you can see this. I don't know if you can see the screen. Can you see the screen? Hello, is the screen visible?
Yes.
No, it's visible. So this is something, it's called Samtal Zameen, Samtal Zameen. It really translates into equal selves, equal lands, because I'm contesting the cultural idea of nature as a relationship of different selves, and also land, equal lands as the planet belongs to all. But it's, if you go into it, then, and you go into these conversations, you will be able to see a series of conversations by with many important thinkers, scientists, artists from all over the world. Some of whom are friends, some of whom I got to know, and on the idea of the multi-species world. And part of this work was also inviting artists to contribute to a journal, to a publication of artists, 30 artists, all friends, who then contributed to their idea of what a multi-species world could look like from their perspective. But equally importantly for me is this, they were also asked to contribute a word to create a new glossary of the multi-species world. So these are words, cultural words from their own thinking about which words would encompass nature, culture, multi-species world. So if you have a time and have the inclination, you're welcome to look at it at some point. So I'll end there. I think I'm pretty much at the end of my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You were faster than I expected.
Did I
thank you
finish
so
too
much
fast?
for this very inspiring presentation. Yeah, nice pictures also about all your work that you have done. I really like it.
Thank you.
Now we have around
I want to leave some
questions.
I want to
So
leave
if
some time for
keep
questions.
short,
Yes.
I have several questions. Who would start? Yes, I'm coming to you.
Thank you, Ravi, for your wonderful presentation. And I really appreciate that you brought into the discussion that nature is not one, but many. And also, I think that your ideas about rethinking nature led us to think nature also as a worlding practice, like a sort of pluriverses, a way where nature and culture are entangled and intertwined. So I want to ask you if you found, working with the fishing communities, other definitions about what conservation means, and also for your artistic practice, if these other definitions of nature led you think about other ways of conceiving art. And yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, there are many experiences with the fishing community. For example, they know when not to go and fish when the fish are really small. It doesn't require a law. They know that if they fish at the wrong time, then they will not be able to fish later. They're able to read the sea. They're able to read that they are the future with the ocean, and they also deal with. So they also know why the beach is slowly being eroded because they live on a fishing beach, and in a fishing beach it's very important they have the place to pull their boats onto the beach. Otherwise, they cannot park their boats. So parking the boat is an essential part of the landscape, and they preserve that fishing beach because so uh, they also are against these large trawlers, which are you can see on the horizon, because they use these trawling nets. And so, because their relationship to the ocean is so deep and so for a long time, and they know it's a livelihood, they have a very different idea of it. For example, you know, after the tsunami, the government built many cement houses for them behind some distance from the beach. So though their families live there, in the evening they'll come and sleep on the beach. So I asked them, why don't you sleep in their house? Why do you sleep here? They said, we cannot sleep without the ocean breeze and the sound of the ocean in our ears. So this relationship to the sea is deeply ingrained in them. They don't see anything as conservation or non-conservation. For them, it's an ecosystem which needs to survive. They sometimes also they catch, fish which they should not be catching. They throw them back in the sea because they know it's no use for them to catch those fish. So it's in the language also, in their terminology also. The word nature has a very different meaning. It's not the way we use word nature in English. So it's a complex but very embodied relationship, I would say.
Thank you very much. We have another question here. Share your name and where you come from so we can, because he cannot see you.
Hello, thank you so much for your inspiring talk. Is the mic okay? Yeah, okay. My name is Lotte. I'm based in Paris, and I wanted to come back to your point of purity and pollution and the way it becomes naturalized. It made me thought of the recent book by Max Byron on pollution and colonialism. And so the way how actually this massive transformation of multi-species environments that are nature culture environments finishes up by being also a category that repeats discrimination. And I wanted to hear you a little bit more about that relating to caste, but also beyond. So what are you observing, experiencing, but maybe also transforming in this naturalization of this binary opposition? Thank you.
I don't claim to be transforming anything. I don't know if I can transform anything, but in terms of being involved in this issue, I think it's a very, very important issue of because justice is the basis of society. And we see that we see decreasing visibility down the social hierarchy. So we see the poor less, we see the lower caste even less. We just don't see them. And like we don't see very often women. And then we don't see them more than human at all. I mean, they are outside all of our thinking. And I've been thinking a lot about this idea of the more than human, especially when we think of AI. This question of intelligence and consciousness has come up a lot, including in many kinds of research projects, etc. And the question whether consciousness and intelligence are the same thing, whether sentience and self-awareness and intelligence are the same thing, whether problem-solving ability and being self-aware are the same thing, is something we really can't answer. I mean, this famous essay that I think it's called Why I Can't Be a Bat of the 1970s or something of that similar name, which is it's a transformative essay which talks about sentience. And our inability to think about sentience outside the human sphere really makes us treat the more than human world in classical ways, as we know, including this idea that the only way we can know how to conserve wildlife, what we call wildlife, is mostly through larger flora and fauna, in the most visible, which is an old problem, but also not think of ecosystems. So when we think of ecosystems, of preserving ecosystems, then we think very differently of what we are trying to preserve. So it's a complex question. It's not easy to sort out because there are so many historical problems in why this is so. But I really feel that if you think of the more than human, then we open up the sphere to think about the the sphere outside the anthropogenic sphere, which is really, really important. The relationship to that is really, really important as well.
Thank
I
you
don't know
very
if I've
much.
answered that
There is
question.
one question more. And do we have questions online? I don't see it. Okay. Go.
Thank you so much for this deep dive into your practice. You made a side note, but I would be really interested in hearing more about it, that you call for an allyship between science and other ways of knowing. And for me, the first a connection that I made was Bruno Latour's Matters of Concern. And I'm just wondering what references you have, what kind of methodologies and refigurations we need for this kind of allyship.
Well, more than methodologies, may I use the word posture? Posture of listening, a posture of humility is where I start from. A posture that I don't know what it is really, and I need to know through various collaborations. And of course, the word transdisciplinary is thrown out a lot. It's not an easy word to tackle because disciplines have their own boundaries, disciplinary boundaries. But when I collaborated with Dr. Lopez as a glaciologist, I learned a lot about the method of science from a scientist perspective. And as I said, scientists don't make the claims which we make of them. We make political claims of science, but science is messy as well. You know, behind these claims about what science, there is a lot of messiness, lots of questions about what is true and what is not true, the hypothesis, and I think it is a method, and I think it's in the aspect of different methods of knowing that we have to acknowledge different ways in which we can know something side by side. So I work though I trained as an engineer, so I'm aware of the method of analysis and science, but I work as an artist. And when I go and work, for example, in a landscape like the fishes or the flower landscape, I go with a curious mind of seeing what is happening and listening deeply to what is happening, to what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing. And that's why I don't call it a project. I just call it a kind of research investigation which might lead to something. I think we have to figure these ways out, but we have to be open mind to do it. There's no one way of doing it, but we have to acknowledge that there could be many views of the world and many ways in which the world can be known, which is not only known through one method of science.
Thank you. Any question else? I think we have still a couple of minutes, and I would like to keep to pose a question in this relation. You said that the nature can be seen in different ways, and I was thinking that it can be defined also differently. And in the presentation before, we heard about restoration, conservation, different types of definition, different types of way of looking into it. And I have one colleague that he analyzed wilderness in Switzerland and how it's defined, and when do you start to conserve wilderness. And the more dangerous it gets, the more you will be willing not to conserve it, let's say, because it's going to be dangerous for yourself. If it's close to you, we can see it in Switzerland with the wolf. And I wanted to ask you, how do you see the future? How is arts going to be developed in the next 30 years in this field? How will history talk about us? What do we need to still have some nature in the future, because now you say that there are different ways of watching it, but I think we need still to have some kind of political will or societal will, whatever, to conserve what is to be conserved in order to be able to say that we are still part of this nature environment.
Well, it's a very broad question, very hard to answer. I'll just give you my reflections on it. I feel that we are moving through. We're going to create areas of scarcity in the consumption levels we have today, and of course inequitable consumptions level. And there is going to be, even if we don't like the word crisis, for example, in water, water access globally is already a problem in many parts of the world. These are not small things. These push people to an edge, in a sense. It will force us to think. It's no longer a question of comfort of how we research. It's a question of how we survive, I think. So I think we are coming closer and closer to that. The Club of Rome in '72 told us about the limits to growth. We threw that out of the window. And today we are already past 1.5 degrees, as we know. So I think, I've seen in Switzerland, I've seen the Rhone Glacier with a big white tarpaulin over it, which is 10 meters over everything else around it, in a sense. So you can see it's visible today. And in countries where you have less resource conflict, it's going to be easier because you can always make do. But in countries which have greater resource conflict, which are the most populous parts of the world, this is coming to an edge, I think, and it'll force the kind of questions we ask in the academia also. It'll force us to think differently. It already is, I think. The questions we ask have to be really the key questions of futures and survivals. I really feel art has a very pivotal role to play because at least art which asks questions. I'm not talking of only market and gallery-based art, but art which is keenly involved in raising opening up boundaries and thinking creatively, because it can bring in people outside the expertise, which is really required right now. And I said that this idea of expertise is overdrawn. Also, it's important, but it's overdrawn because, as you saw from the fissures, there are many people who are aware of what's happening. If you think of the nomadic people in the Himalayas in India, they will tell you that they're going less and less up the mountains because the grass is coming down. So the landscapes themselves are changing, and these are landscapes of livelihood and living. So I feel that it's for us to catch up to what the key questions are and to form the collaborations on the ground with communities who are living these places and work with them. So I think the time of sitting and watching is gone. We really have to collaborate and help find some innovations and answers.
Thank you very much. It was a very, very nice answer. And for us, it's also time to stand up and have a little bit of break. So I thank you very much.